Good afternoon, everyone. So, we are beginning our exploration of the lead up to the Civil War this week. The big question that we will begin asking this week is the what really caused the Civil War? How do we get to a point where half the country is wanting to go to war with the other half? We're going to start off today by talking about westward expansion, the settlement and acquisition of Texas, the Mexican War, and the United States acquiring a vast amount of new territory in 1846. This might seem like an odd place to begin talking about the Civil War. After all, many of the major battles of the war were fought in the states along the East Coast and certainly east of the Mississippi River. So, what does the West, the region west of the Mississippi River, have to do with the Civil War? Well, everything, it turns out. In order to understand the big question, why did the Civil War occur? What caused the Civil War? We have to understand what is happening in the 1840s and 1850s with the West, because it was in the West that the Civil War really began. Fundamentally, it comes down to the question of what was going to happen to the territory that the United States gained, first with the Louisiana Purchase and then with the Mexican War, and specifically whether slavery would be allowed to spread into this territory. This is the thing that tears the nation apart in the 1850s and directly leads to the secession of the southern states and the coming of the Civil War. So, in order to talk about the West in the 1840s and 1850s, we first have to examine this idea of manifest destiny. The idea about manifest destiny, the phrase was coined by a journalist in New York named John L. O'Sullivan in 1845. But it expresses an idea that was held by many Americans for a long time before that. Uh, it's the idea that freedom is linked with the availability of land, particularly land in the West. So, manifest destiny meant, as John L. O'Sullivan sort of originally put it, that the United States had a divinely appointed mission, obvious to everyone or manifest, to occupy the entire North American continent. It is both a label and a justification for the policies of American expansionism or imperialism, and an assumption, a basic assumption of white supremacy permeated these policies. It never occurred to US policymakers or journalists like Sullivan to seriously take the claims of people of color or racially mixed societies to their own territorial integrity. America had a divine mission to perform. The expansion of the United States was going to secure the North American continent both for liberty and for Protestantism. There is also a strong strain of anti Catholicism here. Support for Manifest Destiny came from many different groups in American society: Western land speculators, railroad promoters, small farmers. They all have obvious interests in westward expansion. Many Northern working class men also saw it as a guarantee of economic opportunity and higher wages. Americans in the early 19th century talked about creating a, quote, empire for liberty. Many believed that the settlement and the economic exploitation of the West was going to prevent the United States from following the path that Europe had already begun to go down, becoming a society with fixed social classes and a large group of wage earning, poor industrial workers. In the West, where land is readily available and there's not as much oppressive factory labor, there is a continued chance to achieve that economic independence that so many people prize and which was seen as such a social condition for freedom. So we start to develop this national mythology, this ideology that sees the West as the last home of the freeborn American. Now, this is deeply ironic because at the same time that Americans are pushing to settle in the region beyond the Mississippi River, in order to seek that dream of economic independence and quote unquote freedom, some Americans are attempting to bring slavery, the very antithesis of freedom, into the West. So the debate over the wisdom and morality of national expansion provokes a renewed debate about the future of slavery. Between 1840 and 1860, nearly 300,000 men, women, and children braved disease, starvation, the mountains, attacks by Native American groups to travel to the West, traveling mainly overland to Oregon and California. In the 1840s, these lands were not even officially yet part of the United States. The United States and the British were jointly administering the territories of the territory of Oregon. The territories of Utah and California and other parts of the Southwest were officially, up until 1848, part of Mexico. This does not stop Americans from coming into and settling in these regions. So there's a real intensification of this belief in manifest destiny. The settlement of Oregon does not directly raise the issue of slavery. Most of the settlers who came to Oregon were not from the South, and they had no desire to establish slavery in the territory. Southern politicians acknowledge this fact. One member of Congress from South Carolina said that it is not probable that a single planter would ever desire to set foot within its limits, talking about Oregon. And John Crittenden, a congressman and senator from Kentucky, said no sensible man would carry his slaves there if he could. Now, this does not mean, of course, that Oregon was full of abolitionists either. When it became a state, Oregon adopted a law prohibiting free blacks from emigrating to Oregon. So this indicates that the settlers of Oregon didn't want slavery in their territory, not so much because they abhorred the practice, but because they did not want black people to be a presence in the territory. It was really the acquisition of part of what was then Mexico that brings the issue of slavery to a head. A little bit of background here. Mexico achieved its independence from Spain in 1821. It was a country that was nearly as large as the United States. It had a population of 6.5 million, two-thirds of that of the United States. So it's, smaller in population, but in terms of geography, almost as big. Its northern provinces, the areas of California, New Mexico, and Texas, these were sparsely populated, very isolated outposts. There was a large Native American population here. California's non-native population in 1821, which was about 3,200 missionaries, Spanish or Mexican soldiers and Mexican settlers, was vastly outnumbered by about 20,000 Native Americans who were living and working on land owned by these religious missions. And about 150,000 were members of unconquered tribes. So it's mainly populated by Native Americans. By 1840, California had already become linked commercially with the United States. Ships from New England came around the southern tip of South America and traded with Californian ports. So people in the United States are already beginning to think about annexing California at this point. The first part of Mexico, however, to be settled by significant numbers of Americans was the area known as Texas. The non-Indian population of Spanish origin there, the so-called Tejanos, were only about 2,000 in 1821. So it's very sparsely populated. And in order to develop this region, the Spanish and then the Mexican government accepted an offer by an American named Moses Austin to colonize Texas with Americans. In 1820, Austin received a very large land grant. He ends up dying soon afterward, but his son, Stephen, continues with this plan. In 1821, Mexico achieves independence from Spain, and the new Mexican government says, okay, you have the right to be a colonization agent, tells Austin you can come in and bring in settlers. So Austin brings in about 1,500 families and starts attracting settlers from southern and western states. The land there is fairly cheap. And by 1830, the Americans in Texas are outnumbering the Tejanos, the Hispanic Tejanos, more than 2 to 1. The Mexican government pretty quickly realized this was not the world's greatest deal. There were so many Americans who were flooding in and they were basically taking over. So in 1830, the Mexican government annulled existing land contracts and barred further immigration from the United States into Texas. Led by Austin, American settlers demanded the Mexican government give them greater autonomy, and some of the Tejano elite joined them in this demand. They were able eventually to get this law repealed in 1833. Mexico's desire to promote the economic growth of the Texas region eventually outweighed their fears that this was not going to be in Mexico's national interest to allow so many Americans to come in. So ranchers, large farmers, they really welcomed this economic boom that all this brings. So by 1836, there are at least 35,000 Anglo-Americans in Texas, now outnumbering the Tejanos, the Hispanic Tejanos, 10 to 1. The issue of slavery further complicated things. Mexico, by this time, had officially abolished slavery, but local authorities in Texas allowed American settlers to bring enslaved people with them. Texas, it turned out, was a great place to grow cotton. To get around the Mexican government, some settlers pretended that their enslaved people had signed long-term labor contracts, essentially voluntarily committing themselves to lifelong servitude for no pay. Obviously, that was patently absurd, but this was how they sort of got around it. By the 1830s, it was becoming increasingly obvious to the Mexican government that things had started to get a little out of hand in Texas, and the Americans, there are just too many of them, and they are starting to flaunt Mexico's authority. So in 1835, Mexico's ruler, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, he sends an army into Texas to impose central authority, and this sparks what becomes known as the Texas Revolt. American settlers and their allies among the Tejano population formed a provisional government that called for Texan independence. And they were hoping to kind of rally some other states in Mexico to support their cause. They start talking about parallels between the Texas Rebellion and the American Revolution. Newspapers in the United States are reporting all of this, and they're reporting it in a very sensationalist way. They're looking to boost circulation. This starts to draw thousands of young men from the South and the West into the region. They are looking for a fight. On March 6th, 1836, Santa Anna's army besieges a mission/fort compound in San Antonio, known as the Alamo. 150 or so defenders, mostly recent arrivals from the United States, are sort of defending this fort. Among them were a couple of frontier celebrities, Jim Bowie, who was famous for his, large knives, and a former congressman from Tennessee, Davy, or David, as he preferred to be called, Crockett. These men at the Alamo were hoping to be able to hold the fort until reinforcements could arrive, but Santa Anna comes and surprises them with this very large army, larger than they had anticipated. And in the assault on the Alamo, Santa Anna's army of 1,500 fight their way in, and they kill all the defenders, suffering very heavy casualties themselves. After the siege at the Alamo, the phrase "remember the Alamo" becomes this rallying cry in the American press. The following month, in April of 1836, forces led by Sam Houston, who was the former governor of Tennessee, won a victory over Santa Anna's army at the Battle of San Jacinto, and they force him to recognize Texas independence. So in October 1836, Sam Houston wins the Texas presidential election. They declare the Republic of Texas is now a independent country. Sam Houston's longtime personal friend, the outgoing American president, Andrew Jackson, says, well, officially the United States is going to be neutral, but we're not going to prevent or do anything to prevent the Texans from getting rallying men and getting arms and funding for their cause. And on his last day in office, March 3rd, 1837, Jackson officially recognizes Texas as an independent country. Very quickly afterward, the Texas Congress calls for uniting with the United States. Uh, Afraid of what might happen if another enslaving state is added to the Union, President Martin Van Buren puts the question of annexing Texas on hold for the time being. So Texas remains an independent republic for the next 10 years. Americans, though, continue to pour into this new Republic of Texas, many of them enslavers. By 1845, the population of Texas was around 150,000, and 27,000 of them were enslaved people. The annexation of Texas remains on the back burner until President John Tyler revives it in hopes of rescuing his failed administration and getting Southern support for his renomination in 1844. Tyler had become president in April of 1841 after the death of William Henry Harrison. And he does not have he is very unpopular. He doesn't have support from either the Democratic Party or the Whig Party. He was such an unpopular president that some members of Congress tried to bring impeachment proceedings against him. They failed, but this was the first time that a president had faced a serious threat of impeachment. Tyler was very much in favor of annexing Texas, though, and as part of his attempt to rehabilitate his reputation by adding Texas to the Union, he appoints John C. Calhoun as his Secretary of State. In April of 1844, a letter from Calhoun is leaked to the American press, and in it, Calhoun talks about annexing Texas to help strengthen slavery. Some Southern leaders were actually hoping to divide Texas up into a number of states, all of which, of course, would be slave states, thus further enhancing the power of the South in Congress. Leading members of the Whig Party, anti-slavery advocates, anybody who's opposed to annexation because they were afraid that it might provoke war with Mexico, were appalled to hear about this plan. Henry Clay and Martin Van Buren, the leading Whig and Democratic candidates for president, met together at Clay's Kentucky plantation, and they agreed to issue letters rejecting this idea of annexing Texas. For Martin Van Buren, this proved to be a political misstep. At the Democratic convention later that year, Southerners who were determined to annex Texas, they desert Van Buren, and he fails to receive the necessary two-thirds majority to become the nominee. The delegates then turn to a very little-known figure, a man named James K. Polk. He was the former governor of Tennessee. More importantly, he supported Texas annexation, and he has the support of the Democratic Party's most popular figure at the time, Andrew Jackson. To appease Northern Democrats who were unhappy about this, the party platform called for both the annexation of Texas and the quote-unquote reoccupation of all of Oregon. So Polk is the first real dark horse candidate for president, somebody whose nomination was completely unexpected. And in the fall, he ends up defeating Henry Clay in an extremely close election. Polk's margin in the popular vote was less than 2%. But his victory settles the question of Texas annexation. In March of 1845, just a few days before his inauguration, Congress votes and declares Texas to be part of the United States. So in his inaugural address, President Polk gives a ringing endorsement to the annexation of Texas, and he declares that wherever Americans choose to settle, the federal government is going to extend its protection over them. Polk was very ambitious. He was virtually unknown. He had not been a major political figure up to this point, but he has a clear set of goals now that he's become president. He wants to cut tariffs. He wants to reestablish an independent treasury system. He wants to settle this dispute that had been running with Great Britain over who really owns Oregon. He wants to bring California into the Union. The first three he soon accomplishes. He gets Congress to enact a legislation on the tariff and the Treasury. He is able to negotiate a treaty with Great Britain, dividing Oregon at the 49th parallel. California, though, is a thornier problem. Polk sends an emissary to Mexico offering to purchase California. The Mexican government refused to negotiate with him. By the spring of 1846, he is looking to get California however he can, and so he's preparing for military action. He sends soldiers under the command of General Zachary Taylor to the border region between Texas and Mexico. And when fighting inevitably breaks out, Polk claims that Mexicans had, quote, shed blood on American soil and had calls for a declaration of war. The Mexican War was the first American conflict to be fought primarily on foreign soil, and it's the first in which American troops end up occupying a foreign capital. The majority of Americans, inspired by this idea of manifest destiny, supported the war. But there was a significant opposition movement, though. Many feared that the real motive behind this war was to acquire new land for the expansion of slavery. Henry David Thoreau was jailed in 1846 for refusing to pay taxes as a protest against the war, and this is when he writes his famous essay on civil disobedience, which is later going to inspire activists of nonviolent resistance to unjust laws. In his essay, Thoreau states that if a government passes laws, quote, of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. What I have to do is to see, at any rate, that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. So he calls upon his fellow abolitionists to withdraw their support in person and in property from the government. Another critic of the war was a young politician who had been selected to Congress in 1846 from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. He questions the premise behind the war. He's very disturbed by Polk claiming the right to initiate this invasion of Mexico. He ends up losing his seat in Congress in 1848 because of his opposition to the war. So we do end up going to war with Mexico. More than 60,000 Americans volunteered to enlist and fight. There are really three main fronts in the war. In June of 1846, a group of Americans proclaimed California to be independent from Mexico. They named Captain John C. Fremont, the head of this small expedition, as their leader. And they're sort of looking to follow in the footsteps of Texas by declaring their independence and then getting incorporated into the United States. In July, the U.S. Navy sails into Monterey Bay and San Francisco Harbor and raises the American flag and declares that California is part of the United States. At the same time, 1,600 American troops under the command of General Stephen Kearny occupied the city of Santa Fe without any resistance. It was central Mexico that saw most of the fighting in the Mexican War. In February of 1847, Zachary Taylor defeated Santa Anna's army at the Battle of Buena Vista. When the Mexican government still refuses to negotiate, Polk orders American forces under the command of Winfield Scott to march from the port of Veracruz to Mexico City, and they are occupying Mexico's capital city by September. The Mexican War has sometimes been called a rehearsal for the Civil War that's going to come 13 years later. And this is true not only in the sense that many senior officers in both the Union and Confederate armies get their first taste of combat in the Mexican War. Strategically as well, the United States faces some similar issues as the Union would in the Civil War. The U.S. in the Mexican War has to invade and conquer a vast country in the face of determined resistance. And this is what we're going to see happen in the Civil War as well. One of the biggest prizes of the Mexican War for the United States was California. California had a non-Native American population of less than 15,000 at the end of the Mexican War. Prior to this, more Americans had been heading for the Oregon Territory, but all of this changes after January in 1848. This town of Coloma, California, was a very small, remote town located in the Sierra Nevada mountain range on the South Fork of the American River. And a carpenter there named James Marshall was supervising the construction of a sawmill for a local businessman named Johann Sutter. On the morning of January 24th, 1848, Marshall is inspecting the channel of his water wheel when he notices some very shiny looking distinctive particles amid the sand in the water. He carries them back in his hat to the workers who are eating breakfast and announces, "Boys, I believe I've found a gold mine." So they tried and failed to keep this gold a secret. Early in May, a shopkeeper hoping to promote trade at his store walks through the streets of San Francisco waving a sample of this gold and shouting, "Gold, gold, gold from the American River." By mid-June, three-quarters of the men in San Francisco had left to go to the gold country. Because the telegraph had not yet reached the state of California, the area of California, news of this discovery traveled faster by water than by land. It actually first spreads around the Pacific Rim. By July, gold seekers from the Hawaiian Islands and the west coast of Mexico are heading to Northern California. Over the summer, 2/3 of the white men in the Oregon Territory are heading south. Throughout the autumn and the following winter, people begin arriving from Chile and Peru and Australia and China. Many veterans from the Mexican War end up responding to the appeal of the goldfields and come, north to look for gold rather than go back home after the war was over. The East Coast of the United States learns about this discovery a little bit more slowly. On August 19th, 1848, the New York Herald ran a small sort of article from a soldier in California under the headline, "Affairs in Our New Territory." And buried within this article was a sentence, "I am credibly informed that a quantity of gold worth in value $30 was picked up lately in the bed of a stream of the Sacramento River." This doesn't really get national attention until President Polk, who is very eager to show that California had been worth a war, highlights it in his annual message to Congress. 2 days later, a shipment of gold worth almost $4,000 arrives in Washington. It's meant to be sent there to be cast into medals to be given to military heroes of the Mexican War. So this is sort of deliberately promoted by political leaders. Now you start to see reports of this gold beginning to circulate up and down the East Coast and across the Atlantic and Europe. So the Great California Gold Rush of 1849 is now on. The gold rush really stimulated the production of currency and helps to alleviate the shortage of currency that up until now had really plagued the United States economy. So now that there is plenty of gold in circulation, now there is, sort of very little objection to some of the fiscal policies that the Democratic Party had been pushing for. And there's less need for paper money, there's less need for a national bank. So it really ends up boosting the prospects of the Democrats. The easiest, but also the slowest and the most expensive way to get to California at this time was to sail about 15,000 miles around the southern tip of South America. The quickest option was to take a ship to Central America and then cross either Panama or Nicaragua by foot, taking, pack mules and canoes maybe, and then you had to wait for a passing ship on the other side to take you the rest of the way. With a good connection, that trip could be made in maybe 5 to 8 weeks. This was a very dangerous route, though, because you had to go through this very tropical region and there were all kinds of diseases there. More than half of American migrants chose a third route, coming overland. This took at least 3 months and it was the least expensive option, but it still requires investing in a wagon and oxen to pull the wagon. As a result of the gold rush, California's population increases much more rapidly than other societies along the West Coast. By 1852, the non-Native American population was up to 200,000, and by 1860, it's up to 350,000. Who came to California during the gold rush? It was mainly small farmers, middle class townsfolk, anybody who could kind of raise money or borrow money for the trip. A lot of different kinds of people came to California in search of gold. It was the first state in the Union to really be settled by people from all over the world. So it's this very diverse population, really from the get-go. The first participants were those who lived in the region. Of course, the Californios, the Hispanic Californios who had lived there for, generations. There were some Anglo-Americans who had already settled there, and of course, Native Americans who lived there. You also see people coming from Hawaii, from Latin America, from Asia. You have inexperienced Americans coming from the East. You have immigrants coming from Europe, Australia. You have about 25,000 Chinese immigrants coming in. About 90% of the people who came to California were men. And most of them were gold seekers who were hoping to get rich quick and return home. They were not looking to stay and build for the future necessarily. A lot of people came for adventure as well, which doesn't exactly create a society where, people are, terribly interested in establishing kind of a well-ordered society, let's say. They end up destroying the local environment in many places. Even after they actually set up a state government, these mining camps were essentially like, governed by themselves, and it wasn't too far removed from mob rule. There was a lot of violence, a lot of real rough justice that went on. And there were a lot of racial tensions that were inflamed by this desperate hunt for gold. Miners in California generally opposed the introduction of enslaved people into the region, not because slavery was unsuitable for gold mining, but because the use of unfree labor would give some people such a huge advantage that individual prospectors would be forced out of the gold fields if the large slave owners came in. That same fear of the competition for cheap labor also manifested in vicious persecution of Chinese immigrants who were brought in to mine in the gold fields. And the gold rush ends up being a complete disaster for the Native American population in California. They were not allowed to stake gold claims either individually or by tribal gold claims, and they were often coerced into working for other people, generally at very, very low wages, sometimes basically in virtual slavery. Native American communities get overrun. Thousands are murdered. There is lots of state-sanctioned violence against the various tribes. Thousands of Native American children are actually bought and sold as slaves, even though California was technically a free state. By 1860, the Native American population in California had gone from 150,000 at the end of the Mexican War to now only 30,000. So we have acquired this vast amount of territory. Before 1846, the status of slavery in all parts of the United States had been settled, either by state law or by the 1820 Missouri Compromise, which had said that Missouri could enter as a enslaving state, but that the rest of the Louisiana Purchase was going to be free territory. But the acquisition of all this new land now after the Mexican War reopens this question of slavery's expansion. In the summer of 1846, just after the beginning of the Mexican War, President Polk is trying to get funds that he's going to use to negotiate an eventual treaty by which the United States will get territory from Mexico. And so he sends Congress a request for an appropriations bill for $2 million to pay Mexico in the event that the war goes well and that they can, negotiate to get land. Polk's critics among the Whig Party had been accusing the administration of seeking to expand the area of slavery. Now, other Northerners are coming to share this concern. So they decide to send Polk a message that their concerns need to be listened to. And in the course of this debate in Congress over Polk's request for this money, a junior representative from Pennsylvania, a man named David Wilmot, he takes the floor to speak and he offers an amendment to the appropriation. And it says that, as an express and fundamental condition to the acquisition of any territory from the Republic of Mexico, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of that said territory, except for crime, whereof the party shall first be duly convicted. This very short, very sort of, seemingly very clear amendment is going to go down in history as the Wilmot Proviso. Now, Wilmot is not an abolitionist. He actually frames his amendment as an appeal to the white working class, not as a humanitarian benefit to Black Americans. He actually calls his proposal the white man's proviso. And he says that its purpose is to, quote, preserve for free white labor a fair country, a rich inheritance, where the sons of toil of my own race and own color can live without the disgrace which association with Negro slavery brings upon free labor. Wilmot's amendment ends up passing by a vote of 80 to 64. And every single no vote comes from, except for 3, come from the enslaving states. Southern members who had been the strongest supporters of the bill, they decide once this Wilmot Proviso is amended to it, they suddenly switch and they say, we would rather kill this appropriations bill than accept it with the exclusion of slavery. So the eventual vote in the House on the amendment is divided almost entirely along sectional lines. So the amendment then goes to the Senate, where it ends up dying and expiring. So President Polk ends up getting his $2 million. It actually goes up to $3 million. And the Wilmot Proviso never actually ends up becoming part of the law. But what is significant here is that the party lines are starting to crumble. And the vote on this amendment is entirely divided along sectional lines. And so this controversy over this idea really is kind of the first real indication of the sectional divisions that are going to come into full view, the deep divisions that are growing in this country over the expansion of slavery. So in February of 1848, the government of the United States and Mexico sign a treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which confirms the annexation of Texas and the cession of California, present-day New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, parts of Wyoming, and Colorado to the United States. And you can see the territory that was part of the so-called Mexican cession here. By this treaty, the United States acquires an area of more than 500,000 square miles. Next to the Louisiana Purchase, it's the largest single addition to our nation's geographic region. Polk, however, is not necessarily overjoyed by this treaty. Some radical expansionists had actually been calling for the United States to annex all of Mexico, and maybe even Cuba and parts of Central America. Polk almost lets his ambitions get the best of him, but he recognizes that this war is deeply unpopular among some Americans, and demanding even more territory was probably not going to be a wise political move. At the time, reactions to this vast new territory were mixed. Democrats were happy with this, but they weren't necessarily content. They continued to want even more territory. One Whig newspaper called the treaty a peace which everyone will be glad of, but no one will be proud of. Frederick Douglass expressed a deep bitterness in his newspaper, the North Star. He said, they have succeeded in robbing Mexico of her territory and are rejoicing over their success under the hypocritical pretense of a regard for peace. The people who end up most being affected by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo were the residents of the land that Mexico is giving up, including some 90,000 Hispanics and a much larger number of Native Americans. According to this treaty, these people are going to become U.S. citizens unless they act to retain their Mexican citizenship. However, Mexican Americans find themselves really generally treated like foreigners in a country where their people had lived for generations, now that they're part of the United States. So many end up losing a lot of their property. They are surrounded by Americans who are flooding in and eager to take advantage of them. The state of California places very heavy burdens of proof, of legal proof, on owners of land that had been granted to them by the Mexican government. They don't actually end up recognizing Mexican Americans as citizens until 1870. And in New Mexico, the Hispanic population there does not get their promised rights of citizenship until after it becomes a state in 1912. Of course, those who end up suffering the worst of all are the tribal Native Americans in California. Now, this is, of course, an ironic triumph for this concept of manifest destiny. Now, the American Republic truly stretches from sea to shining sea, but the triumph in the Mexican War has subjected the country to some very big internal stresses that are going to lead over the next 13 years to a supreme crisis. Much of what had bound the nation together rested on the existence of a balance between the northern and southern parts of the United States, the areas that have freedom and the areas that have slavery. The decision to fight the war, rooted in this concept of manifest destiny, has disturbed this balance. And the acquisition of all this new empire endangers this balance even further. Ralph Waldo Emerson perhaps put it best when he said that if the United States acquired part of Mexico, it will be as the man who swallows arsenic. Mexico will poison us. So we're going to start to see how this begins to tear the nation apart. And we're going to sort of talk about the emergence of some new political parties around some of these issues. The election in 1848 marks a change not only in the party in power, but what we're starting to see here is the crumbling of the second party system. The economic issues that had dominated the America during the period of Andrew Jackson's rule and John Quincy Adams' rule, now these economic issues are no longer the pivot around which politics is moving. We're starting to see a shift towards sectional issues here. So President Polk has won this new empire. Now America has to decide what are they going to do with it. And particularly, are we going to have slavery in this region? So within just a few years, a new party system, the one which we still have, at least for now, is going to arise in response to this challenge. So in 1848, Democrats nominate Lewis Cass of Michigan, and he proposes that the decision on whether to allow slavery should be left to settlers in the new territories. This is an idea that's later going to be called popular sovereignty. A group of northern opponents of the Democrats' sort of embrace of popular sovereignty and opponents of slavery's expansion come together and organize what they call the Free Soil Party. They nominate Martin Van Buren and Charles Francis Adams, the son of John Quincy Adams and the grandson of John Adams, as vice president. Van Buren's campaign really ends up appealing to a lot of Northerners who are opposed to the expansion of slavery. And their slogan is free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. They end up winning about 14% of the Northern popular vote. In 1848, Zachary Taylor, the Whig candidate, ends up winning the presidency. He's a hero of the Mexican War. He is a slave owner. He owns a Louisiana sugar plantation. But the fact that Martin Van Buren, a former president, and the son of another former president, Charles Francis Adams, had abandoned their political parties to run solely on a platform of limiting the spread of slavery, suggested that we're starting to see anti-slavery sentiment beginning to grow in the North. And a lot of Northerners had long resented the fact that Southern politicians were really dominating the federal government. They were trying to kind of prevent the creation of new slave states. And this appealed to those who favored policies like a protective tariff and like government funding of internal improvements that the majority of Southern political leaders opposed. A lot of Northerners saw the potential to move to these new Western territories. And so they bought into this idea of manifest destiny and free soil as an alternative to economic dependence for workers in the factories in the East. And if slavery comes into these lands in the West, that would mean that they wouldn't be able to move there. And so the term free soil had kind of a double meaning. The idea of free soil called for both barring slavery from the Western territories and also for the federal government to provide free homesteads to settlers in the new territories. Now, this is not an abolitionist party, and they are not calling for equality for Black Americans. They were appealing to the racism that was really widespread in the North at this time. To white Southerners, however, the whole idea of the Free Soil Party is totally anathema. Southern leaders are becoming increasingly convinced that slavery has to expand or it's going to die out. And admitting any new free states is going to overturn the delicate balance and make the South into a permanent minority. So we're starting to see a real hardening of party lines along this issue of slavery. So during and then after the presidential election in 1848, Congress is continuing to debate over what to do with this new territory in the West, and things are getting increasingly contentious. Nothing is getting done. Congress is totally deadlocked. A number of Southern states are already threatening secession. So we're really facing a grave crisis here. And it all comes to a head in 1850 when California asks to be admitted to the Union as a free state. Southerners are opposed to this. They are fearing upsetting the sectional balance in Congress. Henry Clay, ever the great negotiator and compromiser, he comes up with a plan that becomes known as the Compromise of 1850. So under the Compromise of 1850, California would enter the Union as a free state. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, would be abolished in Washington, D.C. Congress would pass the Fugitive Slave Act, meant to enforce a provision within the U.S. Constitution that a person held to service or labor in one state, escaping into another, shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. We're going to get to more of that in more of a minute. The status of slavery in any of the remaining territories that were going to be acquired from Mexico was going to be left up to the decision of settlers. And so essentially, in the Senate debate over Clay's compromise, we start to see divergent sectional positions emerging. We start to see Northerners saying, sort of, if we have to keep the peace, we're going to, sort of accept some of these compromise proposals. And, we need to kind of, sort of make sure that we're going to, kind of keep the peace. Southerners are, kind of increasingly uncompromising here. Eventually, they sort of end up passing the Compromise of 1850. And it's still left unclear what's going to happen with slavery in the territories. There's not going to be any kind of outright ban. There's not going to be any kind of geographic line. But what does this mean? It's going to be left up to the settlers themselves. So essentially what they did here is kind of kick the can down the road. The one thing that really becomes a huge issue out of the Compromise of 1850 is the Fugitive Slave Act. This makes further controversy almost inevitable. So the Fugitive Slave Act basically says that anybody anywhere in the United States has to essentially participate in tracking down any person who has escaped from slavery. So now we have, kind of hundreds of flesh and blood people who have risked their lives to gain their liberty, who may now be, sort of forced back into slavery. now we have, sort of this law that allowed special commissioners to determine the fate of an alleged fugitive slave. You don't get a jury trial. You don't even get to testify on your behalf. It sort of paid people to, kind of catch enslaved people. It prohibited local authorities from interfering with the capture of fugitive slaves. It required individual citizens to assist with that capture when they were called upon by federal agents. So, in the eyes of many Northerners, this meant that the federal government had not only gone into the business of slave catching, but it also that every free-born American was now being forced to support and even assist in the capture of fugitive enslaved people. So this is really a very controversial law, and it's going to further widen sectional divisions. The real significance of the Fugitive Slave Act was demonstrated in the way that the American public reacted to a fictional story of slavery that began to appear in a serial form on June 5th, 1851, in an abolitionist newspaper in Washington, D.C. The author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, had not been a terribly successful writer up to this point, but this story was different. It was announced that it was going to run for about 3 months. It becomes so popular that it quickly ends up continuing for 10 months. Then it gets published as a book in March of 1852, and it takes the country by storm. In its first year of publication, more than 300,000 copies are printed. It quickly gets turned into a stage show. And ultimately, it ends up selling 3 million copies in the United States and another 3.5 million around the world. It outsells every other American book of the period. Now, if you look at the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin today, it does not age well. Its characters are very stereotypical and unrealistic. Its plot is very sentimental. We would probably consider it to be pretty offensive by modern standards. But none of that is important. What matters about this book is the impact that it had upon readers in the 1850s. It made the plight of enslaved people real for Americans in a way that simply, other things had not. These were stories of real human beings, or at least very, realistic human beings, held in bondage. And the Northern attitude towards slavery was really never the same after Uncle Tom's Cabin was published. People who never cared about real people who were enslaved are feeling for the characters in this book, and it really goes a long way toward turning Northern public opinion further against slavery. So we're starting to see things shift a bit here. At least temporarily, the Compromise of 1850 restores the sort of sectional peace and the party unity. In 1852, in the 1852 presidential election, the Democrat Franklin Pierce wins over the Whig candidate Winfield Scott on a platform that recognizes the Compromise of 1850 as the sort of settlement of the slavery controversy. If you had been alive in 1853, you would have thought that the elite enslavers had become the rulers of America. They were only a small minority of the U.S. population, but because they controlled the Democratic Party, they had managed to take control of the Senate, the White House, and the Supreme Court. And they were using that power to stop Northerners who wanted to get legislation to improve the country through Congress. And they were doing this all in an effort to kind of not to prevent anybody who, opposed slavery from using the government to, stop the spread of slavery across the country. Now, at this point, the much larger population in the North still has control of the House of Representatives. And so they really feel like they need to kind of, put a check on what the Northern politicians are doing. So, believing that the issue of slavery in the territories is now kind of safely on the back burner, Congress turns toward looking to facilitate the building of a railroad across the continent. But in order to do this, this territory that it's going to pass through has to be first organized. And so the issue of how is it going to be organized? Is it going to be slave or free? It's rearing its ugly head again, just a few years later. So in 1854, a senator from Illinois, Stephen A. Douglas, introduces a bill to provide territorial governments for Kansas and Nebraska. He's a strong believer in manifest destiny and in Western development. He's really looking to kind of build this transcontinental railroad. Southerners in Congress are adamantly against allowing the organization of new free territories that might upset the sectional balance. And so to win their support, Douglas applies the idea of popular sovereignty, the idea that the status of slavery would be determined by the local settlers, not by Congress. The problem was that Kansas and Nebraska, unlike the lands that were taken from Mexico, these are in the heartland. These are directly in the path of westward migration. And so slavery had been prohibited there already under the terms of the Missouri Compromise. And so Douglas's bill would effectively repeal that. With the help of the Democratic president, Franklin Pierce, enslavers in Congress are able to push the Kansas-Nebraska Act through the House. So it overturns the Missouri Compromise. And because the Constitution guarantees the protection of property, and enslaved Americans are considered property, the expansion of slavery into those territories meant that new states there would become enslaving states. Their representatives would then work together with those of the southern slave states to outvote the northern free labor advocates in Congress. So the concern was that so if these territories in the West became enslaving territories, they would vote along with the South, and slavery would become national. So America would become effectively a slave-owning nation. And enslavers were quite clear that this was their goal. A senator from South Carolina named James Henry Hammond, he gave a speech in Congress that said he explicitly rejected as, quote, ridiculously absurd that much lauded but nowhere accredited dogma of Mr. Jefferson that all men are born equal. And so he explained to his colleagues in the Senate that there are two classes of people in the world. There are what he called the mudsills, people whose work produced the food and the products that made society function. And on top of these so-called mudsills rested what he called the superior class of people, who took the capital that the mudsills produced and used it to move the economy. The superior class had the right and the duty to rule over these inferior classes of people. This eventually, the Kansas-Nebraska Act ends up becoming law in 1854. And so now, after 10 years of effort, the land beyond the Missouri River now has a territorial government. But it's going to really sort of cause this massive controversy, and it's going to completely shatter the party politics in the United States. We're going to see the Democratic Party in the North really declining dramatically. The South is becoming solidly Democratic, and it's going to completely realign American politics. So what we are really seeing here is that the bonds that were holding the nation together are beginning to fray under the strain of slavery. And one of those bonds was the nation's two political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats. So in the 1850s, both of these national political parties are becoming divided along sectional lines. In 1852, we see the southern wing of the Whig Party completely destroyed in the elections. In 1854, the northern wing of the Democrats gets crushed, especially with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so both parties are becoming, kind of suffering this loss of sectional balance. The Whigs are unable to hold on to the North, and they're unable because of that to continue as a party. The Democrats, on the other hand, they are able to solidify their hold on the South, and they're able to endure. And we're starting to see kind of new parties beginning to emerge. Once the Whigs collapse, we start to see other kind of parties like the Free Soil Party and the Nativist Know Nothing Party kind of coming in. But eventually what we're going to see, especially after 1854, is the emergence of a new political party. As soon as it became clear that Congress was going to pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a representative from Maine called a meeting of 30 congressmen in Washington, D.C. to try to figure out how they could fight back against this slave power that had really taken control of the government and had spread, and to do this, they were kind of commandeering the government to spread slavery. So these men who were opposed to this meet in the rooms of another representative from Massachusetts, Edward Dickinson. He happens to be the father of Emily. And they meet together. And these are men coming from all different political parties, divided over specific politics. But their sort of sole purpose is do not want the country to become dominated by this enslaving power. They feel like this is the overthrow of American democracy. And so they believe we need to sort of establish a new party to stand against the slave power. And they find anti-Nebraska sentiment starting to kind of sweep through the different towns and cities in the North. A young lawyer from Illinois recalled how ordinary people came together in this effort. He said, "We rose each fighting, grasping whatever he could first reach, a scythe, a pitchfork, a chopping axe, or a butcher's cleaver." In the next set of midterm elections, those who were calling themselves these anti-Nebraska candidates sweep into national and state office across the North. And by 1856, we are seeing a new political party, the Republican Party, emerging. So it's becoming the major alternative to the Democratic Party in the North. And their appeal really rests on the idea of free labor. They say that the North is the home of progress and opportunity and freedom, that there is a free society and a slave society, and that they are representative of this free society. And they said, we want to stand for the ability of ordinary men to become economically independent, that slavery was degrading to this idea of free labor. And everything really sort of depended upon the availability of land. So if slavery were to spread into the West, northern free laborers would be barred. And so slavery had to be kept out of the territories for free labor to flourish. Now, Republicans were not abolitionists. They are focused upon preventing the spread of slavery, not attacking it where it exists already. But as we're going to see, Southerners and Southern politicians are increasingly coming to see any sort of attempt to limit the spread of slavery as being an attack on the institution itself. And that is really where this line is going to be drawn. And we're going to get to that a little bit later this week and next week. All right, so before coming to class on November 20th, you should make sure to read chapters 12 and 13 in your American Yawp book. There are a couple of reading quizzes there, and then your outline or first draft of your American Slavery project is due, so make sure that you do that as well. All right, and I will see everybody in class on Wednesday. Take care.